I'd now like to call on Leslie Weiss to report on the action plan for anti-Semitism in the former Soviet Union and the Eastern European region. And while she's coming up, I should also mention that in addition to her position at NCSJ, she is the recently appointed chair of the U.S. Commission on the Preservation of America's Heritage Abroad. Leslie.
Thank you, Dan. I also want to thank my co-chair, Thomas Kraus, and a special thanks to the members of the Working Committee for their participation and recommendations. Thank you. State-sponsored anti-Semitism is virtually non-existent in the former Soviet Union and some post-communist countries, some of which are today members of the European Union and some others. However, traditional anti-Semitism, rooted in history, and popular anti-Semitic stereotypes remain an issue of concern in many of these countries. In this region, manifestations of popular anti-Semitism, such as desecrations of Jewish cemeteries, memorials, anti-Semitic graffiti, and attacks on Jewish institutions, unfortunately continue. Skinheads, neo-Nazi groups that target ethnic minorities and advocate racial and religious hatred are active, while violent attacks motivated by xenophobia and racism are primarily in Russia and are directed mainly at natives of Central Asia and the Caucasus. Anti-Semitism remains a central part of the extremist ideology in the region. In certain countries in this region, ongoing restitution efforts and issues of national identity spur anti-Semitic sentiments, hate speech, historical revisionism, and equating the history of the Holocaust, linking it with the history of communist totalitarian regimes. In some of those countries, radical right-wing and extremist political parties remain popular, and support for some, such as Jobbik in Hungary, Svoboda in Ukraine, and Ataka in Bulgaria, is growing. In many countries, hate crime legislation is inadequate and its enforcement is not consistent. The weak rule of law and pervasive corruption in these countries hinders implementation of such legislation. There is an inconsistency in local governments' condemnation of incidents of anti-Semitism and to the incitement of racial, ethnic, or religious hatred. Anti-Semitic stereotypes are pervasive among the general public and are rarely targeted through mainstream educational efforts. Difficult historical issues and nation-building challenges which confront the governments of some of these countries in the region often lead to historical revisionism and impede such educational initiatives. In these countries and others, we often see a virulent anti-Semitic response to articles on Israel appearing in the mainstream media. Coalition building with other ethnic and religious groups and international and regional political organizations is happening in some countries, but not all countries in the region. Our recommendations. Governmental institutions in the region need to undertake reactive and proactive steps to combat anti-Semitism by developing adequate hate crime legislation, improving enforcement mechanisms, educating different population groups about xenophobia and anti-Semitism, developing a better mechanism to confront extremist political messages, and isolating the extremist political parties, building coalitions among ethnic and religious groups, and utilizing regional and international organizations, specifically through legislation. And there's a need to adopt a binding document with a clear definition of anti-Semitism. The existing hate crime legislation needs to be improved, building on the current best practices from successful models, such as in the United States and Western Europe. It's recommended that the establishment of an ombudsman or institutions of ombudsmen for combating anti-Semitism has proven effective and should be expanded. The working group also recommends that there's a critical need for the training of law enforcement in this region to identify what is a hate crime and to implement the existing legislation. We need to improve the monitoring of anti-Semitism in these countries and of hate crimes, and to unify the methodology of collecting data. We encourage the fulfillment of these OSCE requirements and the strengthening and cooperation and exchange of information among institutions collecting this data. Another recommendation is, of course, education. Holocaust education is important, but shouldn't be the only tool to combat anti-Semitism. Knowledge of Jewish history and the contributions made by Jews to these countries, as well as to the global civilization, need to be promoted. At the same time, the suffering of other victims of totalitarian regimes should be acknowledged and learned about. The working group recommends that governmental institutions and NGOs work together to ensure greater education about xenophobia and anti-Semitism, including increasing public awareness of the new anti-Semitism. Government, institutions, and NGOs and others should create and implement training programs at a national scale for public servants to raise awareness about the necessity to combat anti-Semitism and other forms of hate, and to conduct a scholarly and comprehensive examination of the history of World War II and the Holocaust. Developing and implementing school curricula is also a priority. Educational outreach to the general population about the dangers of anti-Semitism and xenophobia is also encouraged. This includes outreach to opinion makers, clergy, academia, and political and cultural leaders. Finally, coalition building with other ethnic and religious groups is central to developing relationships and to effectively combat bigotry and prejudice. Greater utilization of regional and international organizations, especially the UN, the OSCE, and the European Parliament, is recommended. Many of these recommendations require adequate public-private partnership. National government carries a large, but not the sole burden of these responsibilities. Regional and local governments, as well as private institutions and individuals, must assume the share of responsibility to address issues of anti-Semitism, xenophobia, and extremism in their respective countries. Thank you.